thank you all for coming again tonight. We're so pleased to be able to present this class free of charge, thanks to the generosity of donors like you. So if you would like to help us develop future programs and events, please consider making a donation to the NCMC through our website or by texting. We're very modern these days. You can text NCMC to 44321. And I don't know if you all saw from last week that these videos are up on YouTube. The last week's video is up. So if you have a chance to check out our YouTube channel, it's there, so you can catch up on things. And this will go up as soon as we can get it up onto that platform. So if you have any questions about that, please call our office. We're happy to help with anything. And I apologize about the link tonight. We'll get all the, you'd think by now we would have Zoom webinars down pat, but every once in a while we get a little snag. So I appreciate everyone's patience tonight. All right, thank you so much. Thanks, Nick.
All right, so week 2, we're going to be talking about riots and scandal as sort of were a bit of an odd trope that kept on cropping up in the beginning of the century. So first we'll be talking about Igor Stravinsky, the Russian composer, and his influence over what was at that point essentially a dead art. I'm sure I was joking with one of the members about the sheer amount of music that I sent last week. Of course, I don't expect everybody to sit through it, but it was like, yeah, it's great, Nick. Thanks for the 10 hours of music. But I mean, to be fair, adding a Wagner opera alone, double increases the amount of time you're going to be listening to something by about a factor of 10. So that's my only defense. I promise that the listenings in the future will not be quite so gratuitous. I hope you all had a chance to listen to and watch the Rite of Spring. For those of you who haven't had a chance to watch what I sent, it is a recreation of the original Nijinsky choreography, which I have to say I've seen a number of productions, and I've seen a number of different interpretations, and truly nothing comes quite close to the original. Of course, it's sadly not the original. It's very difficult to actually keep records of choreographing things. There's all sorts of parameters that you have to be able to I guess keep record of, and this is my rudimentary understanding. It's not the same as say instructions, for a play, or for maybe that's a good way of putting it. Maybe it's more like the stage directions when you look at a Shakespeare play. It's like, you have a handful at best, and that's maybe what you have to work with. But again, I could be feeding you misinformation there. So tonight we're going to be addressing, as I was saying, riots and scandal. So there was this interesting sort of trope in the beginning of the 20th century, these scandals and these things that kept on cropping up in these various artistic communities. I mean, one of the things that we talked about last week, for instance, in Salome, that was a great example. And tonight we're going to have 2 such I guess, phenomenon that have occurred. And the first one will be in Igor Stravinsky and his Russian ballets, Firebird, Petrushka, and the Rite of Spring. We'll also be addressing how that is sort of part of the history of ballet and how he truly revolutionized in many, many ways the art form of ballet, which was actually, sort of in many ways kind of going out of fashion when he took it up again. And of course, the second half of this discussion will be about the second Viennese school, Arnold Schoenberg, Alban Berg, and Anton Webern, and the school of expressionism that their music fits into. We'll also be sort of focusing on Berg's landmark opera, Wozzeck, and the end of, I guess, sort of the utopian ideals of that particular era. Now, the first question we must address, which I'm sure you're all begging to know is, what is atonality? And it's kind of a thorny question. It's not quite as simple as, you know, it is just the avoidance of tonality, because when it has all sorts of meanings behind the word, it's almost arbitrary whether or not something is atonal, and I'll show you why in a second. But all atonality indicates is that we avoid tonality. But what's tonality? You know, it's back to that idea of what most people think of as common practice. And but it doesn't actually encompass much more than that. There are all sorts of other attempts that we're going to address later to cover what music that does not use tonic, or rather sort of a clear hierarchy of values, or rather of notes, to reach a clear harmonic goal. So that is to say, of course, goes to. And again, that's common practice. That is the way that music worked up until 1900. And moving forward, we're going to be talking predominantly about what, in sort of an imperfect term, is atonal music. These other words I've written here, pantonalism, contextualism, motivicism, are ways at addressing the problem, the semantic problem that the word atonal raises. Now, it creates, among other things, this false dichotomy of dissonance versus consonant. Dissonant music is bad, consonant music is good. And this is sort of the general attitude, especially post-Schoenberg. But the truth is that all tonal music, all common practice music, contains elements of dissonance. This is what we call a tritone, one of the more dissonant, I guess, dyads or intervals that can exist in music. But this tritone is necessary for the resolution of this chord. Much like a more dissonant interval, say a minor second, can also be very essential as an expressive device. So the idea that dissonant music is bad and that consonant is good is sort of, it's nonsensical. And so it also, this idea that atonal music is what exists in the 20th century is also just false. There's so much music out there that is very clearly tonal, maybe not common practice tonal, but tonal, that exists after 1900. So I think of Aaron Copland, I think of Benjamin Britten, even certainly Stravinsky too. And what I would like to address today is, I guess, a listening strategy for how we can hear and interpret this music. And in fact, yes, I think that we shouldn't avoid the fact that part of this music involves education, because that is how it was designed. Now, to give you an example of sort of the difference between tonal and atonal music and how it can be kind of confusing in terms of what we hear, I have two examples. The first of which is Voile from Debussy's Preludes, which was written around 1909 to 1910. This particular piece, it can translate as multiple things because of the fact that it does not have the gendered article in front of it. It could mean veils, sails, masks, or sailboats. So there's this sort of, again, like we were talking about last week, this almost misty, unclear, suggestive nature of this. And this is further exaggerated by his atonal approach to this piece. So what we hear is a softening of what we would consider an atonal work, because you see, the work is built up of essentially 6 notes. But the problem there is that we don't actually have a major or minor chord in there. There's no, or you actually get this, or there's no real tonic in the common practice sense sonority. So by technical definition, this piece is completely atonal, but the dissonance is mild. On the other hand, if we take Schoenberg's second string quartet, this is a very tonal work, but it is extremely dissonant. So what we have here is a set of unresolved dissonances. That is to say, instead of we're going somewhere else that maybe doesn't quite make sense. So in the case of this particular work, we have this chord sequence. And then here we have a moment of repose. But where we're really going is here. But by putting so much dissonance and so much delayed expectation, he has basically rendered the final outcome almost unimportant in this context. It's more of a terminating convenience. It's basically there just because that was the old system that was used. And what happens is that in order to make something like, say, Tristan work, there has to be a counterbalancing sense of direction. What Schoenberg has done in this instance is that even though it is tonal, even though it has a key center, a place that it's going, he has so obfuscated it and he has so led us astray from it that when it arrives, it doesn't necessarily feel as though we've gone somewhere nearly as direction oriented as in Wagner. So what is dissonance then? If I've shown you what it is and what it isn't, we can sort of define it as being a roughness in the sound, right? We can tell when something is, say, out of tune, in much the same way that we can hear that something is dissonant, because what is happening is that in the ear, in the physical ear, we have overlapping periodic signals. So say this one, this D that I'm playing right now, when I play the C sharp next to it, the notes are so close together that the periodic signals are interfering and we hear it as sort of a rub, which is why in a context like this, it's more expressive because it almost gives sort of a sourness to the resolution, a bite even. But when you keep on going unresolved, let's say, becomes a color. It does not become functional. It has a different use. So that is the definition that we're going to be working with, which vague and specific at the same time. This is basically to give us tools, or rather words, that we can use as tools to describe the things we're hearing. The other thing about the word atonal is that it doesn't describe many of the other parameters that exist in this music, this repertoire that we're going to be discussing. That's to say rhythm, phrase length, periodicity, the sort of expectation of repeating material. It doesn't address any of that, and that sometimes is honestly the more difficult to understand, but also the easier to hear. So the first composer we're going to be talking about today is not Schoenberg. Oh, surprise! I'm kidding. Igor Stravinsky. So Stravinsky was born near St. Petersburg, Russia, to a wealthy musical family. His father was the famous bass baritone Fyodor Stravinsky, and he received his early conservatory training with the Romantic composer Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, who was particularly famous at the time, not only as the sort of the biggest composer of Russian music, but also a nationalist composer, really someone who was interested in exporting music of Russia. There was sort of a movement at the time to be an amateur musician. For instance, the composer Borodin was famously a chemist as his main profession, and he just composed on the side. And he to his credit, he wrote some really astonishingly beautiful pieces. But being a specialist, being able to write complicated counterpoint, being able to have sort of a trained ear was not in vogue, and Tchaikovsky was actually sort of a counterbalance to that force, being a much more schooled or educated composer. But Stravinsky comes from this particular tradition. And his early successes in his career were with the Ballet Russe and the impresario Sergei Diaghilev, who we will be addressing in particular today. He moved to Switzerland in 1910 and actually toured as a pianist and conductor as a result of all the success. And he became a full expatriate when his family's estate, was taken by the Soviets in the 1917 Russian revolutions. And as a collaborator, he worked with Michael Fokine, George Balanchine, and Vaslav Nijinsky, who were amongst the most notable, famous, and influential choreographers of the era. So now let's take a second to talk about ballet, because it's actually important to know the context in which Stravinsky was arriving, because ballet is one of the most culturally French artifacts that they have today. It was created in the French court, not only as a way of entertaining, dancing, but actually as part of French opera. And it remained this way from the Baroque period, so the ballet operas of Lully and Rameau, all the way through the end of the 19th century. So in all French opera from the 1800s, we see ballet as an important component. It was a required part of it. We were talking about the operas of Meyerbeer last week. All of his operas contained ballets. When Wagner played his operas in France, he had to write ballet music for it. Same thing with Verdi. When Verdi would come and play his operas, same deal. And the main two components of this opera, or rather of the ballet, are pantomime, that is to say, the miming out of action, and ornamental, which is to say things that were just impressive, that were decorative, that didn't serve any sort of narrative function. So what happened in the 1800s is that eventually ballet d'action was created. It was a separate genre from opera. It was its own thing. And it was an aristocratic genre. It was very much limited in its audience. It was aimed towards a particular group of people. And because of the revolutions in the 1848 to 1950, rather 1848 to 1850 time period, this lack of favorability towards the aristocracy and the nobility caused it to go out of fashion, except for in Russia, where the nobility and the aristocracy still had quite a bit of power. Now, one of the reasons why we don't know of too many ballet composers, famous composers, that is to say, in their own right outside of ballet, is that it required a very specific set of skills. The composer was completely subservient to the choreographers in terms of what to write. So that is to say, the choreographer would come up with a dance plan, and the composer would have to write and completely cater to what was expected. For instance, I can only really name one ballet off the top of my head by a notable composer from the classical era, which would be Beethoven, which is his work, Creatures of Prometheus, which is a work that is rarely played today. And for the reason that his artistic goals had to be subsumed by the greater ballet's purpose. Now, in Russia, they created what is known as an imperial ballet. Swan Lake, the Nutcracker, those are examples of imperial ballet. But for the most part, Russian composers were actually frozen out of the competition. All the composers and the choreographers were unbelievably imported from France, Germany, Italy. And as I said, Tchaikovsky was one of the sole people who actually was able to make it through. And that was just by pure chance. And the intent of these ballets, by and large, was a spectacle and to delight and entertain those who attended. And of course, an example of this style of music and the style of dance is illustrated here in the Pas de Deux from Act 3 of Swan Lake. So what happened around the turn of the century is that in France, there was a craze for all things Russian. And what happened is that Diaghilev and the Ballet Russe became a part of the culture. They would essentially, for about, I think, 20 years, I think more than 20 years, would go back to France and present at first Russian operas, Russian music, but then exclusively Russian ballets. And what is sort of funny about the whole thing is that the Russians for a very long time viewed France as the height of aristocratic nobility, the height of culture. And so what wound up happening is that the product that was given to the French was insufficiently Russian for the French, who were all clamoring for something that was authentic. So you had a French product that was exported to Russia that was then being exported back 100 so years, maybe 50, 75 years later. That was an attempt to appear French, but in fact needed to be more Russian. And what also happened because of the way that this developed is that ballet was excluded unintentionally and intentionally from the main sort of high art of, say, the Mahler Symphony or the Wagner opera. And what happens with Stravinsky is that he is given an opportunity to turn the ballet into what could be considered a type of Gesamtkunstwerk, Wagner's concept of the complete work of art. And it is clear in many ways that Stravinsky succeed. So the first, his breakout work was The Firebird. It is classic, this idea of the spectacle ballet. It's kind of a hodgepodge of various Russian folk tales. The essential plot is that a prince comes along an enchanted garden, enchanted palace of the King Cache, who has imprisoned a set of princesses who the prince wishes to marry, and with the help of the Firebird, he manages to release all of them. It's almost a non-plot. The plot is not particularly important. What's important is the spectacle. And the thing that is interesting musically here is that there is a bifurcation of the two types of music for the different characters of the work. There's music for the humans and music for the supernatural. What we hear is a harmonic difference. So one group, which is the humans, are given folk music. This is the Russian part of what we're talking about. On the other hand, the magical beings, such as the Firebird, are given treatment to a type of scale that is called an octatonic scale. It is notable because of the way that the intervals in the scale work out. It winds up being a symmetrical scale, kind of like the whole tone scale. So the whole tone scale, octatonic scale. And this is a scalar system that was sort of codified by Rimsky-Korsakov and used by him to again create this dual reality for the two types of character that exist. So here is an example of the human music. Here's an example of the Firebird's music. So you can kind of hear very clearly the types of orchestral music that he gives it. He uses colorful, evocative music to the Firebird, these sort of grand gestures, these arpeggios, these huge sort of almost cartoon-like gestures. On the other hand, you have sort of the simple, straightforward, beautifully orchestrated, but still very simple folk tune for the people. Now, just fast forward a little bit. Another one of his Russian ballets is Petrushka. This is his second big success. It's kind of, as I've written here, Punch and Judy meets Commedia dell'arte meets Shrovetide Fair, with a sad twist. So Petrushka, it simply means Little Peter, is the Punch of Punch and Judy in Russian lore, and the Commedia dell'arte being the Italian sort of stock characters from their puppet show. The basic concept is that there is a love triangle, in this case between Petrushka, the ballerina, and the blackamoor, who each it's sort of the Petrushka loves the ballerina loves the Moor, and what winds up happening is that Petrushka is in a fit of rage, goes after the Moor, and usually in this scenario, Petrushka kills the blackamoor and has the ballerina. But in this case, the blackamoor kills Petrushka, and at the very end, his ghost comes to haunt the puppet master of the show. This final component, Shrovetide Fair, it's an important celebration in Russian culture, where it's sort of a street market. It's with carnival barkers. There's games. There's shows, and this is the folk music component, the Rimsky-Korsakov component of this. And this particular work actually originated as a piano showpiece for Stravinsky as he toured around, and you'll hear that in the second excerpt that I show you. This sort of piano concerto that happens in the middle of this work. Now, the difference this time is that you still have the same bifurcated music. You still have the two, the octatonic music and the human music, but this time the human music becomes almost pedestrian. It's sort of facade-like in its quality. It's meaningless. It's sort of just potpourri of waltzes and dances and the sort of cavorting of the world, whereas the puppets are the only ones in this particular scenario that are able to have emotion, which is particularly notable in this scenario with Petrushka, who we will see. So the first example I have is of this human music. Human music in this Dans Rus, which is danced by the three stars of the work. Now I'm going to contrast this with music from the second tableau, Petrushka's Room. Now, what we hear is an integration of this octatonic harmony with the melody. And so what has happened is that he has taken two chords, two major chords, and this becomes the sort of consonant harmony of this particular section. And again, so this is just a little bit of a ratcheting up of that dissonance that we were talking about. It's just a little bit. It's more a way of communicating these characters' nature than anything else. So again, you can kind of hear that extremely virtuosic little piano part. It's a wonderful work. But these two kind of pale in comparison to what the following work does in terms of its musical reception and the sort of impact it would have on history. So the Rite of Spring was conceived as sort of from a dream that Stravinsky had of this great sacrifice, this idea of this primitive sacrificial rite in which a virgin dances herself to exhaustion and death. And this sort of was a project that had been coming for quite a long time, for several years. He'd been sketching away at it for a while, and he was interested in this sort of primeval Russian aspect, and this idea of primitivism was becoming more and more popular around this time. There are a number of works that pay homage to this. And he worked with Nicholas Roerich, who was a Russian artist and archaeologist, on sort of creating something that was more authentically Russian, more clearly part of the package that he had to present as a Russian in the Ballet Russe. And he worked with the choreographer Vaslav Nijinsky, who was a member of the Ballet Russe and who actually premiered as not only the lead role in Petrushka as Petrushka, but also back in Debussy's Afternoon of a Faun as the Faun. And this was his big debut as a choreographer. And what Stravinsky did to sort of maintain absolute authenticity is he actually went back to a bunch of old books and collections of Eastern European music. For instance, Rimsky-Korsakov had a selection of cataloged Russian melodies, and he was particularly interested in songs relating to matrimony and matchmaking as this sort of fertility rite. And there are a number of things, aside from the sort of gruesome plot, there are a number of musical features that he uses to create this effect. The first of which, and the most important perhaps, is rhythmic unpredictability and ostinato. Now, rhythmic unpredictability meaning that in a normal context, of course, we would know, say, one, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. But instead, in the very first, well, rather the first number with the dancers, you will hear this. What he's done there, of course, is that he has taken the just regular 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. He's taken it out from under our feet. We don't really know where the next beat's going to land. Not only that, but there's this sense of ostinato, which is a Italian word that simply means stubborn. The stubbornness meaning that this figure continues for the entire number. I think it's about 200 some measures. And this is a feature that will be part of both of these things, will be a feature of Stravinsky's music for the rest of his life. So let's hear what that sounds like. What you'll also notice here is, and I specifically chose this particular rendition of the Rite of Spring because it is a facsimile of Nijinsky's original choreography. you'll see that they have actually, there's a very particular way that you're supposed to hold yourself as a ballet dancer. Of course, many of you know the various pliés and foot positions you're supposed to have. What you have done is that in ballet, you're supposed to have your feet, imagine these are the heels, like this. They've actually, Nijinsky had his dancers turn them pigeon toe. So they'd almost be like pre-human forms, almost animal-like. And of course, you see these huge angular forms, these spastic motions. This is all part of that sacrificial rite, this primitive pagan rite. And this is, of course, very much in opposition to the original Tchaikovsky that I showed you. Now, on top of this sort of unfamiliar beat pattern, where he plays with where the beat is, that is in the context of a regular meter, 1, 2, 1, 2. Now, what happens is that he also uses what has been sort of an interesting anomaly in Eastern European music in general, which is the asymmetrical meter, which is to say, you can divide a bar into many different. Into many different ways. The general consensus that there are two ways. You can divide it into 2 or into 3, and everything else is a subdivision of those two things. But what if you wanted to not just go 1, 2, 1, 2? What if you wanted to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? See, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you actually have 5 beats. An example of that actually is in Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition. That is 11 beats total, which would not fit in sort of a standard phrase or metric parameter. So you actually would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In this Mussorgsky example, of course, it's tonal, it's familiar. But the actual metric part of this is quite unusual. And this is something that Stravinsky brings to the table in an even more extreme format in the danse sacrale, the sacrificial dance. What, of course, you probably noticed here is this increase of, in dissonance, this very sort of, intentionally aggressive, primitive style. Familiar chord, adding harmonic pressure. Same thing goes for that earlier chord that we were talking about, or rather the rhythmic impetus before, the. So what he has done is he's, again, combined 2 chords that are very close together. Remember last time we were talking about Petrushka with these 2 chords? He's actually taking it to that minor second that we were talking about even earlier, this very, very close harmony. So he's taken this chord and this chord. What you get is, of course, So this is another element of this. It almost makes this, when it's that close together, it almost makes it sound drum-like, which, funnily enough, goes along with the theme. The next thing that is a little bit tricky to understand is this idea of juxtaposition, interruption, and discontinuity. So what Stravinsky did that nobody really before him did is he had very quick changes of texture, of material, of sort of mood, and these very, very fast changes are basically what make the drama in his music work. We're going to watch an example in a second of this, the sage and the dancing out of the earth. But I also want to get into this idea of layered static blocks of sound. So what this means is that he has several musical ideas going on simultaneously that happen at varying rates. Now, that's obviously kind of confusing, but what I mean is that he'll have this figure, for instance. And then on top of that, he'll have. And then on top of that, he'll also have. And what happens after a while is that this buildup of textures, this counterpoint of overlapping ideas becomes so overblown, it has to stop. It sort of exhausts itself, as is the case in the dancing out of the earth. So again, what we're going to be listening for here is this very abrupt character switch from the sage to the dancing out of the earth, which includes these cycling blocks of musical ideas that come in and out and increase in density. So we're going to go from a very light texture to a very, very thick texture. So this particular work, of course, as many of you may know, caused a riot when it was first premiered in 1913, and this can be explained by a number of reasons. First of all, of course, it's quite a work to take in all at once. It has a lot of elements that would have been, of course, very unfamiliar. But I think really at the heart of things, the audience didn't receive what it had expected, which is to say that it had gone thinking that it was going to see Swan Lake or the Firebird or Petrushka, but instead it got these prehistoric peasants stamping around to this veritable chaos over in the orchestra. And in certain ways, the choreography was more controversial than the music. Although I've heard that ballet people say that it's more about the music than the ballet, but who knows? Point being that it was just not what the audience had expected. And even though even the first night included riots and violence, there were also 4 to 5 encores that evening, and the subsequent performances were packed. And overnight, virtually overnight, Stravinsky became sort of the toast of Paris because of this success to Scandale. And I guess what I'm trying to communicate here in particular is that the scandal was almost more of a victim. Sorry, I guess it's a circumstantial event. That having been said, it's hard to overestimate how radical this work was. The way that he completely integrated these two parts, right, of this bifurcated idea. He's integrated it completely into one thing, the supernatural and the everyday sort of meet as one in this folk avant-garde piece. And the Rite of Spring still to this day is, first of all, it's actually mostly performed in the concert hall over the ballet theater. Not only that, but its reverberations truly can still be felt today. As a composer, I know that I always am thinking about Stravinsky, whether or not I want to be. And as a performer, I know I've played the Rite of Spring at least 6 or 7 times at this point. So that's the place in the repertoire this particular work has taken. Now, on the opposite side of what was happening musically in Europe, so this was all the way back in Austria where we were with Strauss and Mahler last week. We're going to be talking about Arnold Schoenberg, who, for many of you, you know him as potentially the father of 12-tone music and of atonal music as it stands. And for reasons good and bad, Schoenberg has really sort of earned himself rather a notorious reputation. And this was due in no small part to his very confrontational attitude with audiences. So Schoenberg was born in Vienna to a middle-class Jewish family. And as a matter of fact, similar to Mahler, he actually converted to Lutheranism in, I think, 1897. But he converted back to Judaism in the 20s as part of the sort of anti-Semitic sort of feeling amongst the Jewish musical community. He was primarily self-taught, which is honestly pretty remarkable given his music. As a cellist and as a composer, he apparently would take the subscription to the encyclopedia, and he would compose a sonata only when he was given the definition of what a sonata was in the encyclopedia. And of course, it was one of those subscription series where you receive bits and pieces of the book as you go along. His main teacher was Alexander Zemlinsky, who was another late Romantic composer in the sort of style of Strauss and Mahler. But he also received a lot of support from Strauss and from Mahler in his early days as a young budding composer. So his early works are very much in this late Romantic style of Strauss and Mahler. And he would very, very, over the next 10 years, between 1900 to 1910, gravitate towards this atonal style. And he founded, along with Alban Berg and Anton Webern, who we will also be talking about, the second Viennese school. The second, because the first implicitly being Haydn, Beethoven, and Mozart. And this culminated in his own scandal, the Scandal concert from 1913, in which pieces by Berg, Weber, Zemlinsky, and Schoenberg were all shown. Police had to be called. It was a whole ruckus, and it's for a very different set of reasons than the Stravinsky. And it was in 1933 that he ultimately fled Germany and moved to Los Angeles, where he, no question mark, did teach at UCLA. And funnily enough, he and the composers Rachmaninoff and also Stravinsky wound up living all within several miles of one another in Beverly Hills in Los Angeles at around the 40s, 50s. So Schoenberg was part of this artistic movement that many of you may know, Expressionism. And for the Expressionists, art was a deeply emotional expression. And it was influenced by Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams. It dealt with inner trauma. It was very much a painful type of musical experience. It was an exploration of the unconscious in music. In fact, Expressionism really would not have happened were it not for psychoanalysis. And in particular for Schoenberg, it was related to his suicidal ideation and depression. His wife, Matilda, had an affair with him at a certain point, which was sort of marked a transition for him from this late romantic idiom to this free atonal period. And pain for this type of expression was manipulated into art. And there are two halves of this. There's the psychological realism that we were just talking about, this pain as art, and occult revelation, theosophy, all these sort of various spiritualist movements were very much on the rise. And there's this idea that we spoke about last week about the sublime. This was beginning to permeate Salome and Strauss's opera and Mahler. In particular, I think a great way of understanding this occult sublime feeling is in the moment in which Salome kisses the head of John the Baptist. This perverse transfiguration. And the thing that is notable about Schoenberg's attitude towards the audience is the idea of composer and musician as isolated. It is intended to provoke response. It is intended to provoke this sort of combativeness against mass culture, against what he perceived as the bourgeoisie. This again plays into the anarchist and leftist movements and fascist movements that were happening at that time. And the way that he actually talks about some of these ideas sound very, very fascistic. They sound very utopian. And there's sort of an unpleasant side and confusing side of this too, considering that much of this music, much of this philosophy, this expressionist philosophy, is anti-Semitic and quite misogynistic, homophobic, and is very interested in this idea of cultural cleanliness. And of course, ironically, what would happen is that Schoenberg, not only because he was a Jew, but also because of this particular music, would be condemned by the Nazis as degenerate music, which again is ironic considering that he was describing all this other music, this pedantic music, as he would have sort of thought of it as degenerate. So the way I think we need to comprehend this music is the various components that it has. It's that non-tonal music, as you would call it, or pantonal music. Pantonal because it represents all 12 notes equally. Note, we are not going to be talking about 12-tone music today. All the music that we'll be playing today is what we call free atonal, not 12-tone. But this non-tonal music is a rational outcome of the tradition of German music, especially, that came before it. So he spoke in the reading that I gave to you on national music about the various lessons that he learned from Mozart, from Schubert, from Wagner, Beethoven, Brahms, that the emancipation of dissonance, as he called it, was the only way forward. And so it's not only an expressive device of the psychological realism, it's also a scientific tool. It's the idea that all progress is good. Everything forward is the only way. And these were all codified in his Theory of Harmony book, which translates, of course, Harmonia Lehre from 1911. And what happens in a certain way is that Schoenberg, along with a lot of these other artists, understands World War II as a parallel of the atrocities committed, as being a parallel for the cultural violence, the need for cultural violence that is seen and heard in this kind of artwork. And I'd like us to take just a second, maybe to draw our attention to these paintings that I have here on the left. The first is actually a painting of Schoenberg's. He was a rather talented painter, and this particular work, The Red Gaze, is one of his most famous. When we think about this music, it's sometimes more difficult to think about it from the oral perspective than it is the visual, because the abstraction of music is not necessarily easy to understand on a first listening. Music, when we think about the Scandal concert, for example, music is a social experience. We all process the same thing in the same time, and there's an element of groupthink. When we think about what happened, the violence that occurred in this concert, it would never have happened had it been a painting, because you can come back and look at the painting and you can say, for instance, this Kandinsky painting. Kandinsky and Schoenberg were friends. We look at that and we go, I happen to know, I didn't include this, but this particular painting is called The Concert. And then you sort of look at it and you go, oh wait, hold on, that black object, perhaps that's a piano. Perhaps those are audience seats. And then you have to think, maybe you think, what's with the huge a splosh of yellow? What's with the textures? We are able to sort of process that in the space that we need, whereas the music, it's sometimes hard to hear the forms and the sort of traditional elements of the music that present themselves in Schoenberg's work and in the work of the Second Viennese School, as opposed to the artistic sense. So this is what I'd like us to keep in mind as we listen to this music. I'd like to just end all of that sort of me trying to get across the philosophy and the different ways of thinking this, to present you with the most confrontational part of Schoenberg's statement, I think, is if it is art, it is not for everyone. If it is for everyone, it is not art. And this is the sort of the central question that we're going to be asking ourselves as we delve into these works. This little note at the bottom I've written, I must versus I can, I should explain. For him, for Schoenberg, art was an imperative. and it's almost a snobbish imperative. It's that he is somebody who must create art, because who will create it if not him? So I want to explain the parallel actually between these two works in the art with the music. So in the beginning, of course, here we have the portrait. We know that it's a portrait. The second one, as I've explained, we know that it is it's not a landscape. It's a depiction of a room. We know what the parallels are in terms of what they are trying to accomplish. What is their subject? What are they trying to convey? Now I'm going to try to show you here an example of two of the same things that accomplish the same thing musically, but do it in completely different ways. And that's the thing that's unique about Schoenberg, is that he's trying to do very, very familiar things in unfamiliar guises. So this first one is from his big cantata Gurrelieder, which is a huge work. It was immensely popular in the vein of Mahler and Strauss, and it's a densely romantic work. It is about these medieval love triangles. It's over the top. The orchestra is even bigger than the Strauss, quintuple wind orchestras that we see. And it is simply, in this beginning prelude that I'm going to play, the depiction of dawn. And here it is just a sort of a meditation on a single chord. Now, on the other hand, we have this Klangfarbenmelodien from the 5 orchestral pieces, the third of the pieces that he wrote in 1909. And this is actually a very similar idea. The subtext for this piece is the title is, I believe it is Summer Morning by a Lake. And again, it's a very static harmony. It uses this Klangfarbenmelodien means sound color melodies. And it takes this single chord and elaborates on it for the space of about 5 minutes. It's a very static, simple piece, but it's the same idea. It's a depiction of a morning sun over water. It's a static chord. It has very similar gestures. You hear all these sort of little flourishes over the texture of both of these pieces. So again, it's the same idea, just in a different language. Now, the other work I want to talk about is Pierrot Lunaire, because first of all, it's one of his most popular works today, and it was also very popular back in the day when it was premiered. It is a work based on Albert Giraud's set of poems, and it's for a very unusual combination of instruments, which is to say, voice, violin, cello, clarinet, flute, and piano. However, the violin doubles on viola, the flute doubles on piccolo, and the clarinet doubles on bass clarinet. So there's actually kind of a little bit of a pocket orchestra idea. You have two high and low winds, which say the flute and the clarinet, respectively, and you have the two high and low strings, so violin and cello, and then you have the piano sort of filling out for the percussion and the rest of the orchestra. And this work is sort of a dark cabaret version. It's based on of the Commedia dell'arte again. So this is similar to our Petrushka. This is written very, very similar time period. And it's the adventures of Moonstruck Peter, who, Peter being, of course, a translation for Piero, Moonstruck Peter, who is struck with lunacy and has these sort of visions and nightmares, both comic and ironic and truly horrifying throughout these various scenarios where perhaps he's taking the head of a friend and turning it into a pipe, or he can't remove from himself this speck of moon that seems to be stuck to his clothing. So one of the more interesting parts of this is that he introduced this technique called Sprechstimme, which just means speak song. And it was done for Albertine Zema, who was the original vocalist for this work. She was not a classically trained singer, and she was actually an actress. And so this part is not sung, nor is it spoken. It's this sort of melodrama style, spoken, dramatic voice over almost. It's supposed to be haunting. It's supposed to be a sort of like a dramatic reading. There's a famous precedent for this. It was very popular in the turn of the century. Strauss had written a version based on Enoch Arden, which is by Alfred Lord Tennyson, in 1897, which is this large, I think it's like a 40-minute work that sets this large-scale poem. And this is the same idea. So this Sprechstimme sort of gives a very, again, a kind of, I guess, a spooky type of sound. And there's, I guess, it sometimes when I'm listening to it, it reminds me of sort of like a distorted nightclub, a distorted cabaret. And bearing all of Schoenberg's theories of music in mind, we are going to talk about this problem of music with no tonal hierarchy. Because when we think of and, we know that the hierarchy, of course, is here, where it arrives. But how are you going to organize music that doesn't contain that ultimate sort of direction-oriented goal? And what we wind up with is two interesting phenomena. So this idea of the developing variation and the integration of melody and harmony. So what that means is that in this next selection I have for you, Night, from Piero Lunaire, demonstrates this perfectly. It's all based on a 3-note motive. And what happens is that this single cell provides what is called the Grundgestalt, the basic shape, which is going to basically create the entire work. From those 3 notes, we're going to have, he's basically written the entire piece. That is the idea of the developing variation, that it is constantly changing. It is going to constantly edit itself and become something new. That plays into another idea, which is this idea of the Passacaglia. This is a traditional form from the Baroque era where you'd have the same material that constantly changes, constantly is varying. So that is the varying, that is the developing variation. Now, what he has done on top of that is that because it is constantly repeating, it also supplies for us not only the melody, but the harmony. I'll play that up here just so you can hear it a little bit more clearly. So what's happened here is that the interval itself has so overlapped that it has managed to create, again, this Passacaglia, these variations, the developing variation, and both the melody and the harmony. We have all of that, and that's sort of the way that this music is written. Further on, you'll get something like this. And it goes on from there. We have, I guess, just multiple ways of being able to write an entire piece off of just 3 notes. And this is something that he saw as, again, a continuation of music of the past, of Brahms, of Bach. This is all part of what he saw as the inevitable need to move forward and the unquestionable connection to the past. And the point of all these various notes covering one another is that it is supposed to be a depiction of moths covering the sky as Piero is looking up in terror at the sun being covered. So the idea of these motifs covering him, covering the sky, becoming this chaos. I apologize for that. Now, 2 of his students went on to become quite famous, the first of which is Anton Webern. He was also born in Vienna and to an old noble family. Again, like many of these composers, his early music shows the signs of influence from Mahler, Strauss, Debussy, Wagner. And his musical philosophy was even more, I guess, acerbic than, maybe one could even say clinical than Schoenberg's. That music was defined by natural law and not taste. and that evolution in art is necessary. And his style is notable because of its incredible miniature form. It is the complete, his complete mature works last no more than 4 hours total combined. And he's interested in what's known as the chromatic aggregate. This is another technical term that simply means that in a scale we have 12, rather in the Western scalar system we have 12 notes. What it means is that in order for him to move on to another thing, to another idea, he tried to hit all of those notes before moving on. So, you know, that's me making that up on the spot, but that's one way of accomplishing that goal. He's also notable for his sparse textures, his pointillistic orchestration. You'll have the mandolin here, you'll have a clarinet doing a little trill, you'll have a harp, and you'll have the glockenspiel or the celesta playing in the background. Barely anything. It's almost, it's like music that's at the brink of nothing. Sometimes, of course, his music is incredibly, there's a notable excerpt I'll play for you. There's an incredibly loud excerpt that all of a sudden, when you hear the silence, it's almost more deafening than the music itself. He's also interested in symmetrical structures, which will prove important later on in musical development, because his music is some of the most influential going into the 40s and 50s. So what do I mean by symmetrical structure? Things are a palindrome. For instance, if I was to play this series of notes forwards, backwards it would be. So everything is organized, not everything, but many things are attempted to be organized in this palindromic or symmetrical fashion. And the biggest thing to know about Webern is that it's deeply expressive music. Sometimes it's so alien to us that it's hard to catch everything. But Schoenberg once said, you can basically get a novel from a sigh of his, or as it has also been comically put, the amoeba weeps. So, in the interest of time, I'm going to just show you this particular work. Not unless the computer wants me to. And believe it or not, that's a complete movement. That's a full 6 measures worth of music, and every single note counts. It's actually some of the most difficult music that I've played, mostly because of the fact that everything does count. It's so sparse. I'll play that for you one more time. Sometimes it's so unfamiliar that it's hard to grasp in such a short hearing. But upon further hearing, you can understand sort of the romantic lineage that he comes from. Now, the final one we're going to be talking about is Alban Berg. He, again, funnily enough, that second Viennese school, they all come from Vienna. He comes from a bourgeois family, and as a result, he, unlike Webern and Schoenberg, is kind of aloof from this utopian fantasy of what their idea of what this music represents. He was always fairly sickly as a young boy, and he was very actually lucky to be able to receive an education in music. His father died while he was quite young, and what wound up happening is that an aunt paid for his education, and he, along with Weber, met Schoenberg in 1906, and Berg served as essentially a valet for Schoenberg. He was kind of abused by him, sort of sending him off to do his laundry and then telling him to organize the concerts that we're doing, and then having the goal to ask him, hey, by the way, have you had a chance to write any music? And Berg is generally accepted to be the operatic heir to Strauss. And he's known as the approachable one of these three composers because of the sort of built-in tonality, these references to tonality that he places throughout his music. Now, Berg's generally considered his masterpiece, and is one of the most popular operas even in today's repertoire, is Wozzeck from 1914 to 1922. It's based on a George Büchner plot of one of his plays, Wojciech, which was based on a true story. Büchner was a sort of a lost talent. He died at a very young age, but this particular play survived in a reconstructed version, and it is about about a soldier who goes mad and kills his wife, or rather his common law wife, and about the subjugation and the cruelty of the superiors, his captain, his military captain, the doctor, the sadistic doctor who performs experiments on him, on the mockery of his mistress, and also of the humiliation and the brutalization that he receives at the hands of her lover. And it's about this. It's about the poor and about the conspiracy of the circumstances that plague these particular people. And it was inspired by both Salome in terms of its sort of degenerate society quality, and the current events. World War I, of course, would have come and gone by the time this work was completed, and it shows the hallmarks of that throughout. And dissonance in this case is used as an abstraction. That is to say that dissonance is associated in this opera, the deep dissonance, the sort of abstraction of reality, I guess you could say, the lack of cohesion with reality, the separation from reality, the distortion of reality, is associated with oppression, with fate. And that is the sort of omnipresent part of this work. Whereas tonality is associated with basic human emotions, the remorse that is felt at given people's circumstances, the simple appreciation of having a moment of tenderness between Wozzeck and Marie. And what's kind of interesting about this is that it sets up an interesting dichotomy within the second Viennese school, which is essentially dissonance, bad, tonality, good. And we'll talk a little bit about what this means. But the real purpose of the dissonance here is this extended dissonance to make those moments of tonality even sweeter. And the way that Berg constructs this opera is that each act is its own contained musical work. So the first act is a set of 5 character pieces, and each of these character pieces represents a type of character. So there is a Baroque suite for the captain. It's an outmoded satirical form. It's a Baroque form. No one writes suites anymore in the 1900s. Not in this particular style, that is. And the captain is this pompous, sort of cartoonish character. This basically he's constantly belittling Wozzeck the entire time, and that is the form that is used, therefore. There's a rhapsody, this sort of lugubrious introduction to the character of Wozzeck. On the other hand, the second act is a set of 5 movements, each of which sort of outlines a nightmarish scenario for Wozzeck. He discovers that Marie is unfaithful to him, and so the scherzo becomes this sort of hellish dance. And the final act is a set of inventions, and each of the inventions narrows in on an increasingly more specific thing. So, for example, the final variation, where it is a variation on a single note, this is the part right before he actually murders Marie and dumps her body into a lake. So let's just listen to what that sounds like.
Wozzeck, aber hat doch ein braves Weib. Ein blutig Eisen. Was zitterst? Was willst? Ich nicht, Marie, und kein anderer, auch nicht!
So what has happened here, of course, is that as each of these variations become more focused in on one note, we slowly are narrowing in on his obsessions and his sort of single-mindedness, and his essentially, of course, his insanity. And what is notable is at the very end of the opera is that Berg actually sort of opens comes out on stage and provides sort of a Greek chorus of sorts in an orchestral interlude where he uses clearly tonal harmonies as a way of contextualizing all of this dissonance, that ultimately tonality is an escape. It's the abnormal thing. The twisted world in which Wozzeck inhabits is the one that is real. as we hear, of course, sorry, this sort of latent tonality that is deep within Berg is one of the things that makes him so popular, and it also is one of the things that makes this so ties sort of the ribbon on this. And what I'd like to end here with is that it raises a rather important question. First of all, all those little musical details that I was telling you about, the suite and the symphony and the variations. Are we really supposed to hear that, or are we going to marvel at the dramatic effect that these things have? It's a question of construction, or composer as craftsman versus composer as dramatist, and that is, I guess, one of the central questions that we're going to be exploring as we move forward about how do we qualify art. So thank you everybody for being here today.